Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This, and as you might guess, The Appeal. I'm your host for today, Jay Willis. Last month, Portland's Street Response Unit went to work for the first time in the Lentz neighborhood of the city, where members respond to calls related to homelessness or people experiencing behavioral or mental health crises. But the members of this unit are not armed police officers. They're mental health counselors, experts who are specifically trained to help in these situations. The basic idea is that when someone calls 911 for help with somebody who's in crisis and there's no crime afoot, the person who shows up to help doesn't have to have a gun and handcuffs. Now, the Portland Police Street Response Team, for some reason a phrase I cannot say, has been in development for years, and it draws on successful non-police first responder programs in other Oregon cities, most notably Eugene, where Cahoots has been providing this kind of service for a little more than 3 decades. Now, building off this record of success, state lawmakers are working to expand programs like these to potentially the entire state, or at least in theory. So to discuss this effort, I'm joined now by Oregon State Representatives Janine Salmon and Pam Marsh, as well as Chris Bouneff, Executive Director of the National Alliance on Mental Illness in Oregon. Janine, Pam, Chris, thank you so much for being here with me on this late Friday afternoon. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So Representative Salmon, I'll ask you first. Tell me a little bit about how this emergency first responder model works in places like Eugene with the Cahoots program. How are they designed to work? And then I guess just as importantly, the reason we're here, do they work? What's different about them?
I think what's different about them is making sure that we're looking at how we are addressing the needs of community members, so that responses from our law enforcement agents, some of the calls that we get don't necessarily rise up to an act of a criminal. It could be just a mental health crisis. And so it really takes a different set of tools to be able to address that. And I think for me as a representative in House District 30, we have Washington County has been really successfully working and having a program like this to have a mental health response team that really will take those calls and kind of just deliver tools that are very different to a situation that may warrant having officers go that respond to with guns and dogs and other type of equipment. It really is there to basically help people in addressing their mental health crisis and getting them the services they need that can divert them from an actual jail cell.
Representative Marsh, we've seen programs like these work on sort of a trial or a pilot basis, both in cities in Oregon and in some cities across the country. Now, you're among the co-sponsors of this bill to, again, really scale up this model by giving cities and counties across Oregon assistance in replicating it, in creating their own non-police mobile crisis intervention teams. Tell me a little bit more about this legislation and what exactly it's going to accomplish. In other words, I know from what I understand, it's an assistance, it's a funding bill, right? What would this legislation do to help cities and counties get to being able to implement something like this?
Well, probably the most important thing it would do is to provide some money for us to actually do the work. We're asking for $10 million. We would use that money to fund pilot programs across the state in communities that are really passionate about this work so that we can get more mobile crisis units on the ground. In my own community, started looking at this probably a year and a half ago when we were contemplating a very large, very expensive expansion to our jail. And some people who thought maybe that wasn't the right solution brought in the Cahoots program, which is the model program in Oregon, currently located in Eugene, to talk about what they're doing. And it was pretty transfixing. And then, of course, over the course of this year, with the death of George Floyd and a lot of focus on police accountability and a lot of concern around alternatives to law enforcement approaches, I think Cahoots has become extraordinarily famous across the nation as people have sought that model out and tried to figure out what the magic is and how to make it work in their own communities. So the bill is about building our capacity to do this work primarily through giving communities money and support to do it.
I read a lot about cahoots in the last year as people discover sort of the existence of programs like this, alternatives that they may not have previously contemplated. Quick follow-up, you've outlined this legislation. Where does that bill currently stand in the legislature?
The bill is in committee. It will have to go through a Ways and Means process. But we are very hopeful. We've seen leadership really elevate the profile of the bill and include it in leadership priorities. We also have a little bit of one-time federal money that's come in as part of the Rescue Act. So I think an appropriate delegation of a little chunk of that money toward a cahoots program would be extremely appropriate and very much appreciated by the communities.
Thank you, Representative. Chris, I'll turn to you, and I'd like to get some of your thoughts on the consequences of this sort of default police first response, police first approach to crisis response. Where does it come up short in actually helping people, addressing problems, keeping people safe? And how, in your view, would a new model like this offer room for improvement?
Well, it comes up short in that it's a response. We're sending out people who aren't trained to provide a healthcare response to a healthcare situation, whether that is Portland's model, which is really a street response model, or something a little closer to Cahoots, which has application for multiple populations. And what you end up seeing is either criminalization of mental health disorders and substance use disorders, because there's a behavior going on that could be criminalized, and this is one way to kind of remove that behavior from the community and deal with a problem. But people don't get connected to services up to and including incidents where the use of lethal force comes into play, and people who shouldn't die end up being dead, because that's how law enforcement is a threat assessment and mitigate the threat kind of response. Where this conversation is rather fortuitous is the federal government recently authorized 988 as a 3-digit line for connection to suicide prevention. And they gave states the permission to use 988 really as a crisis response system. And they gave states the permission to put on a tax on telecom, just like we do to fund 911 system. The benefit being that rather than having to have a real robust call center in every community, the call center piece of that would be relatively small, and there would be money available really to proliferate mobile crisis all across the state, rather than communities like Eugene or as Representative Marsh identified down in Southern Oregon, really trying to cobble together money in some fashion to provide a response that we know is effective, that would, if done well, would connect people to resources, would keep them out of the criminal justice system, would keep them out of emergency rooms and boarding, and really increase the likelihood that we could help assess that individual or that family and begin a therapeutic process that helps them reach some level of recuperation and recovery, and hopefully ultimately reach good health.
You talk a little bit about the different settings in which this might occur. And I wanted to ask you about that specifically as lawmakers look at scaling this up. Do you think a non-police first responder model can work in more suburban, more rural jurisdictions? Is it best suited for cities? What challenges does this sort of potential expansion present?
It's effective. I mean, the state of Arizona is living proof that this is effective. They remade their Medicaid system entirely, and they do this. They don't rely upon, say, the Eugene Police Department to contribute to the mobile crisis. They have found a way to finance this and provide that service. And Arizona, much like Oregon, has some urban centers, and then a lot of it is very rural. Now, there are challenges, and financing is always a challenge, but you can professionalize this workforce. And really, you think about it this way. These are the EMTs or our paramedics of behavioral health. If you do this right and you finance it right, what you have is an expert workforce that is well compensated, that is available 24/7. And just like an ambulance service, they are there to respond. Now, there certainly will be some disparity or uniqueness, frontier versus rural versus urban, but the model is out there. Other states have figured this out. Not only that, the model's there. We have that with our ambulance service, right? That's what we're trying to mirror, but making that response commensurate to behavioral health crises versus, say, someone having a heart attack or a stroke.
Talking about cobbling together money from different sources, right? Representative Salmon, there's an effort in Congress to allocate somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion in HHS money every year to support these types of programs, much in the same way that the Federal Department of Justice funds traditional state and local law enforcement. How important is this federal effort to sort of pitch into this, to the ability for states, cities and counties to expand these programs? And I'm wondering if you've had any conversations with federal lawmakers about what can be done to sort of get this money flowing.
Thank you. I personally haven't had any conversations with our federal partners directly on this, but I can tell you that at all levels of government, I think we're all seeing the importance in this, and that whether we saw that on our TV screens with how law enforcement was reacting to calls where people were clearly in a mental health crisis. I have local mayors within my district that are very supportive of this model and really need to, especially knowing the constraints on their own budgets, of how important the matching dollars are to them to be able to effectively move these efforts into their cities and to invest in that. So I think I think we're seeing that at all levels, and sustainability is going to be key. So I think initially starting us off to making sure that we have those grant funding so that we can show and give them that startup funds to invest, and then show the results from that. I think people will continue to want to invest in programs like this, because as you can see, the Cahoots program has been such a successful model, and it's truly a humane way to address our mental health crisis for folks. And I'm very proud of Oregon for having such a long history of this.
One of the problems, I think, or one of the challenges in exploring non-police solutions like this is that it can be hard for people to change their mindsets. We invest so much money in policing because we've delegated so many different duties to policing that it can be hard to sort of take a step back and say, wait, how do we reverse this? How do we start investing in other public safety measures, again, that are not armed police officers? Representative Marsh, we've talked a little bit about, again, the history of programs like these in Oregon, and again, how many different profiles have we read over the last year, right, of Cahoots and its track record of success. What's your message to elected officials in places that maybe aren't as far along? What can they learn from your experience in Oregon as they try and figure out how to get something like this started?
Well, over the past year and a half, as our community has sort of tried to coalesce around the concept that's presented by Cahoots, my advice to people in my own community would be the same advice I'd offer to anyone, which is we have to start by addressing our own behaviors and expectations of our police force. This is really, more than anything in the beginning, a community organizing effort. It's going out, it's talking to people, it's helping people understand that there is an alternative to having a cop come to your door for every emergency call. And so we have a cohort of people who have been actively talking about this, using social media, reaching out, trying to discuss it in public settings. In fact, tomorrow night at 5, they are holding a political forum in which we'll talk largely about the Cahoots model, because they're doing a really good job building that base. So I think that has got to be the first step. Your community's got to have that buy-in. And then it's a question of where the funding is going to come from. Just as you discussed earlier with Rep. Solomon, we don't have clear paths toward funding. And most likely it is going to be a scrabbling together of different sources of funding. We talk about taking money from police budgets, But in little towns, that's tough because you have to have a minimum number of police officers on the street to have any effectiveness in your police force. So while there may be some money that you can move around, it's really going to require an influx of new funding. And we're going to have to all work together to figure out what that is.
That principle holds if police are currently doing things that you might consider moving over to non-police first responders. Is it still as important to you to fund police departments at their current level to have the same number of officers on the street?
Well, it's all about the math and the number of individuals on the street. For example, my community of Ashland, I think might have 3 police officer cars on the street in the middle of the night. So to have coverage across that town when bad things do happen, you've got to be able to have the ability to respond to it. So how much can you take away and deflect it? Because you can't really fund half of a police officer in the middle of the night. You either have that car or you don't. How much can you divert from that budget, still provide a minimum coverage for police officers, because we do need them when we need them, and put that money into alternative programs? That's going to vary a little bit by community, and that's really going to take buy-in from members of the community as well as elected officials who drive those budgets.
I want to ask you one more question, because it sounds like you've thought a lot about this with respect to police departments, police budgets. One of the major things that comes up with non-police first responder agencies is that delegating these, non-investigative, non-crime crime prevention duties to police officers kind of sets them up to fail. They're not doing something that they've been trained to do. They're not trained to respond to people in crisis, and it's a burden on them as well, and it makes them less able to do their jobs effectively. What conversations have you had with law enforcement officials about funding these other programs and diverting funds from current police departments in order to help create sort of a more efficient and holistic measure of public safety?
I would say my police officers in Jackson County, my police departments are for the most part very interested in this model. The police chiefs in Ashland and Medford have both indicated active interest. I think the question of taking money away from their existing budgets gets much trickier because they're trying to maintain a force as they see necessary on the street. But they recognize that their officers are going out to situations in which they're ill prepared. They also recognize that other kinds of professionals are much more relevant in many given situations. So I found a whole lot of flexibility and openness to the concept. Funding, I think, again, makes it a little bit trickier conversation.
Thank you, Representative. Chris, I'd like to close with you. Some of the studies of the effectiveness of, again, these pilot programs across the country have suggested that somewhere between 20% and 70% of calls for help that currently go to armed police officers could be handled by somebody else, a different kind of expert. Do you have some kind of sense of what 20 to 70, it's a big range, right? Do you have some kind of sense of what this number could be if this approach would be fully scaled up across the state? How much more effective?
I would say it's somewhere between 20 and 70%. No, it's sizable. Look, you have to think of it this way. This is healthcare. And because people with substance use disorders and mental health disorders, these illnesses manifest themselves in behaviors, we have looked at this as a threat. And lacking any other response, because we didn't train, this is healthcare, but healthcare has never been trained to do this. Healthcare has been trying to pass this off to law enforcement up until modern day. And law enforcement is the last link in that chain. And so they're forced to respond. What a CAHOOTS has shown, what programs, more systematic efforts in other states have shown, that you don't need to do this one on the back of a police budget. Right. This can be done if you consider this healthcare and you use healthcare funding. And that's where I think, again, this is fortuitous because of this late breaking developments with the federal government around the implementation of 988, we may have a funding mechanism where the startup funds that Representative Solomon and Representative Marsh are advocating for, there would be operational dollars behind them. And then it doesn't come down to whether or not Ashland has 2 cars on the street at night or 3. So you infuse it with healthcare dollars, you treat this as healthcare, you made it widely available as healthcare, and now we're not talking about depleting the budgets of law enforcement. What we're talking about is optimizing them. So the dollars we are spending on law enforcement are being spent on actual law enforcement activities instead of a healthcare activity. It's not necessarily that we need to take money away from police departments to do this. We need police to do what police are trained to do, and they're not doing that work because they're responding to a healthcare response. And so in our state, given the interest, like with our representatives here, given the interest with legislators to proliferate this model, we now potentially have a financing mechanism that's late breaking in this session that would give communities like Jackson County the ability to do this. And that would the data show this unequivocally, both in Eugene and in this, like I said, we're modeling ours in Oregon, our planning grant after the state of Arizona. You will save significant law enforcement time, which means you're not trying to put more money into law enforcement, and you can use that additional funding in healthcare.
I know we've got a little bit more time, so I would like to go back to Representative Solomon. Maybe when you're talking to skeptics of programs like this, folks who haven't heard of one before, how do you approach this issue of explaining how this is really an investment in public safety?
I think that our media response is really showing that and helping elevate that conversation now, as that we're seeing that. And I want to say that Representative Sanchez is also partnering with us on this work, and I'm very excited to have her support in this as well. And I want to just tell you from the officers' side of things, when I have spoken to officers in my community, they talked just as you mentioned. They have work that they need to be doing as a police officer that is being diverted currently to mental health crisis and situations. They want to have more support. We also need to figure out, because being a law enforcement officer is in law enforcement is a highly a traumatic job, and we need to figure out how we are investing in the mental health well-being of our officers, just like we do in Hillsborough Police Department. They've made a real considerable effort in there, and actually it looks to be a statewide model that people are looking at, because that can affect their reactions to things and affect their job, and I think that's really important. And I want to give you an example of just last night. I was talking to a parent whose daughter said that she was going to take her own life and she was going to kill herself. And the parent was at such a loss as to what they could do and who they could call, that their response was, I don't know, and I call 911. And then officers come. And then there was a whole other dynamic there. So I think that our community, whether they are someone in a mental health crisis, whether you're a parent, whether you're law enforcement, where you are in this mix, I think that this is an incredibly important effort to be made to truly address the people that are hurting in our state. And I couldn't be more prouder to work on this.
And if I may, Jay, just real quick to add on to that, the one piece we always overlook when we talk about these kind of models is the triaging that goes on when you call a 911 or in the future a 988. It's not just having people to respond, it's having the trained people on the phone to determine this young woman's life is at risk. She may or may not have some lethal means at her disposal, but what she isn't is a threat. And so dispatching law enforcement is inappropriate. What we need to dispatch then are these trained mobile crisis teams. And that's a critical component for success of any of these models, is making sure when you do reach out as a family, who's answering the phone understands how to triage these things to send the appropriate response.
Thank you, guests. I know we're getting to the bottom of the hour here, and I certainly want to be respectful of your Friday afternoons. So Representatives Janine Solomon and Pam Marsh, as well as Chris Bouneff, thank you so much for being here with me today. I appreciate it.
You're most welcome.
Thank you.
So what we've talked a little bit about today is the culmination of decades of the way that America has chosen to deal with public safety. Too often that we've seen the law enforcement infrastructure, the police infrastructure, almost behave like gas, just expanding to fill every last crack that emerges in the social safety net. We see underinvestment in social services on the front end that results in needing police more on the back end, often with these really tragic results. And this doesn't just bloat police budgets, but it also makes it harder to go back and invest in social services and to sort of start from the ground with a new model that would keep people safe from crime without introducing armed police officers into every situation that begins with a call for help. This current model sets police up to fail by requiring them to do things that they're just not trained to do. Programs like Cahoots in Eugene and the Street Response Team in Portland show that there are significant chunks of public safety programs that can be performed by unarmed experts. It's really fascinating to see statewide scaled up programs like this one in Oregon try and realize the concept's full potential. That's all the time we have this afternoon for the Appeal Live. I'm your host, Jay Willis. Please follow Appeal News on Facebook and The Appeal on Twitter for more news, shows, and updates just like this one. Thanks again for watching. Have a good weekend.